Welcome to the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week we tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the global data center, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities ecosystem. I'm your host, Joshua Feinberg from the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute and host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. This live show is for you regardless of what your company does within the data center industry. Perhaps you work for a data center operator, such as a colocation or hyperscale, edge, modular, wholesale data center provider, or maybe you do something related to data center technology or data center facilities, or perhaps you're part of data center construction, real estate, and investment, or maybe you and your team are part of the vibrant outsourced sales and marketing ecosystem. And regardless of what you do on the go-to-market team, maybe you work in some facet of sales, like as an account executive, an AE, or an SDR, or sales development or business development rep, or maybe you're in post-sales, like as an account manager in client success or solutions engineering or something like that. Or perhaps you're in some facet of marketing, field or event marketing, content, social media, demand generation, paid product marketing or product management or innovation, responsible for bringing all the new great stuff to market, from staying super close to your prospects and customers and partners. Or perhaps you're in a indirect business role. In addition to having a direct sales team, perhaps you have an indirect model as well, where you are working on channel partnerships, maybe with integrators or VARs or consultancies or agents or whatever is relevant for your particular business model. Or perhaps you are the executive sponsor, the orchestra conductor, the leader who goes out into the marketplace and recruits the best and brightest to give you and your team and your company the best platform for success in and around the data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. If this is the first time that you're joining us for Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, welcome. We're thrilled to have you with us. Let us know in the comments what you do, what your company does within the data center industry. If you've been with us before, welcome back. We're thrilled to have you with us as well. If you want to make sure that you get a heads up, that you get notified about educational events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox on Sundays. You can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. So what is on the agenda today? What are the 6 big topics, the 6 big questions that we're going to explore? First, we're going to look at how a new AI data center builder and operator can improve its sales. After that, we'll look at how to improve data center heat reuse positioning and sales. Next, we'll turn our attention to how to market and sell data center technologies that improve efficiency and speed. That'll put us just about at the halfway point for this week's show. We'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how a data center engineering, procurement, and construction EPC firm can efficiently generate leads, how a data center sales director can build an effective professional network. And as we head down the home stretch, as we get ready to land the plane on this week's show, we'll talk about how a colocation, cloud, and connectivity provider can achieve its revenue growth goals. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you're currently facing in your business that you think would be a great topic for us to address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching, and we'll add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming episode. So let's jump right into this week's first question, which is, how can a new AI data center builder and operator improve its sales? So your company is a new AI data center builder, construction company, development company, and operator, and you're looking to improve your sales. That is a fantastic question. Usually the best place to start is to get a lot of clarity on what your planned addressable market is and what your SWOT analysis, your strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats look like in your local marketplace, and who you believe your ideal clients are going to be. And usually the answer to this question comes down to looking at the founding members of your team. As a new builder and a new operator, there's a lot of questions that need to be answered. A lot of your best guesses on these questions are going to come from your founding team's experience, what they did in previous roles. Because of how capital intensive it is now to get into the business of building and operating an AI data center, it would be extremely unusual for your founding team to not include multiple members who have worked in and around data center operators in previous chapters in their career, regardless of whether it's wholesale or hyperscale or colocation or hosting or something that's very, very closely related to that. So with all of that in mind, usually you're going to lean on your strengths. So almost always there's someone as well in this particular context that comes from a real estate and an investor background, just simply because, it's interesting, 10 years ago, the kinds of co-location operators that I do strategy and lead generation programs and thought leadership and nurturing and sales enablement, a lot could be best characterized as, I wouldn't say mom and pop, but they were entrepreneurial kinds of businesses where they typically were really happy being in a sweet spot where the companies were doing anywhere from 1 to 5, maybe as much as 8 or 10 million in recurring revenue, annual revenue, or your local currency equivalent. In nearly all cases, all of those previous owner operators have now exited and sold to larger operators. In the case of local data center operators, they in most cases sold to regional, and the regional operators sold to national. It just keeps raising the bar on what's necessary to be efficient and capital intensive across the board. So for a new builder and a new operator that wants to improve its sales, a lot of it comes down to thinking about the core business model that you want to be in. If you're in retail colocation and you're selling a cabinet or two at a time, and you're going to have a lot of 5-figure clients, maybe every once in a while a 6-figure client, then you're in a business where you need a fair amount of scale. And in most cases, for this particular kind of company, for a builder and operator, if you decide that you want to primarily be like retail leaning, colocation leaning, you'll almost certainly have a mix of direct sales and channel partnerships to help you reach as many growth opportunities as possible. In the case of a hyperscale operator or a wholesale data center provider, it's quite common to outsource. One is you're looking for a big anchor tenant in most cases to take either the entire facility or one building on a campus or just a huge part of that overall investment, what a lot of people would call an anchor tenant. And when it comes to anchor tenant, just using the word tenant in general, leans heavily towards thinking about having a real estate partner as opposed to thinking about prospects and future clients and demand generation and lead nurturing and running a sales process. The challenge with retail colocation, as well as especially for new operators that are getting up and running, one of the biggest challenges that a lot of sales teams run into is they'll generate a lot of prospects, generate a lot of leads, and they inevitably run up against that this person loves what we're doing, but there's 18 months or 24 months left on a 36-month contract, and that's a pretty long sales cycle. That's part of the reason why a lot of retail colocation operators love the idea of channel partners, because they're only going to pay the VARs, the value-added resellers, the network integrators, the managed service providers when a deal actually closes and revenue is generated, as opposed to having to pay a base salary and paying for IT and SaaS and MarTech and healthcare and professional development and everything else that goes into building an internal sales team. So that's part of it, is figuring out, do you want to be in more of a lower value, lower ticket higher volume type of business like co-location, or are you looking to be more hyperscale, more wholesale? That's the first big question. And the second question is, when it comes to improving sales, do you want to focus primarily your efforts early on selling clients in your local community, or do you want to set up a digital demand generation platform so that you're able to sell clients who want in on your region, who want in on your location, that aren't necessarily located nearby? What I typically see with most small and new data center operators, like in this case, a builder or an operator, is usually the back of the napkin, kind of the starting point, is they're thinking usually that like 80% of the revenue will likely come from clients that are nearby and 20% will come long distance. Why do you end up with long distance clients? Typically, they want in on your region because of latency reasons. They want to be close to strategic clients or partners, or some other reason where distance sensitivity is a really big deal. In the world we live in now, where geopolitical considerations are definitely reaching digital infrastructure due diligence and thinking about where your assets go, there's definitely some governance issues where people specifically want to have their infrastructure sitting in a certain location because it's within a certain national boundary. And then, of course, there's also a lot of cost of power benefits that come up. And who has power? If you're building and you're operating, hopefully you're at the stage where you've already vetted that there is power and there is cost-effective power in your particular area, either by grid, or you're looking at some form of alternate energy, whether it's natural gas turbine generators, whether it's all diesel, whether it's hydrogen fuel cells, whether it's probably a little early to be talking about a lot of builders and operators considering small modular reactors, considering nuclear. But I think we're probably no more than 3 to 5 years away from that starting to entering the more mainstream conversation on alternate energy for getting a new data center project up and off the ground. But for improving your improving sales for building and operating, almost certainly in the same way that your founding team includes deep expertise on the IT side and on the facility side and on the construction and on the real estate side, it's super, super common for your founding sales leader, whether you call it a sales director, a VP of sales, a chief revenue officer, chief commercial officer. And again, the C levels will largely depend on your capital structure as well. Usually your board or your investors are going to want a certain say in how you figure all of that out. But in most cases, you're looking for talent that has done this multiple times already. The challenge is across the board is finding the talent that has done this multiple times at your stage. It's very, very different to be the first sales hire for a brand new data center builder and operator that has basically no brand of its own except for the founder's individual's brands. It's very, very different to be in that role compared to selling for a huge global data center operator, like being one of hundreds or one of thousands of people in a sales or marketing role working for a huge company like Digital Realty or Equinix or something like that. Very, very different. So what I'd lean on also for those early hires, regardless of whether you're talking about sales, marketing, account management, product, operations, is try to find a mix of talent that's worked in large companies and a lot of entrepreneurial companies. And when in doubt, don't be afraid to take the risk on the entrepreneurial companies. Usually your boards, your investors are going to lean more heavily on hiring the logo. Why do they hire the logo? Because it feels good to put a logo on your homepage about the fancy brand name, well-known clients that you have. And usually when it comes to evaluating CVs, when it comes to evaluating resumes and LinkedIn profiles, our tendency is to default to that same shortcut. The reality, though, is it's a pretty dangerous shortcut for an early stage company because, again, the amount of resources that you have as an account executive working for a sales organization where there's 300 hires and a handful or two of people in sales enablement and sales operations and marketing operations, and a handful or two of people in marketing is very, very, very different than being the first sales hire where you're wearing all of those hats. And oh yeah, there isn't even a full-time marketing person yet. So you're responsible for all of your own prospecting and all your own lead generation. And oh yeah, by the way, you have Canva. So we got your Canva account and a HubSpot account. So you're going to run marketing in your spare time as well, in addition to figuring out how you're going to sell and fill up this entire facility. And the talent exists that has that experience, but don't underestimate the challenge of finding the right people who have that mix of experience, where they've been in roles that early on, where they've had to literally wear 8, 10, 12 different hats at any given time. Not to mention that even if your company has a technical co-founder that's basically also serving as the first chief product officer, head of product, your salesperson early on, because they're on the front lines, is in a phenomenally powerful position to listen for cues for what should go on the roadmap next that's preventing a deal from getting over the finish line, but could get over the finish line if your company invested in a certain kind of credential or a certain kind of feature set or something that was in high demand with some of the early prospects, the early future clients that they're spending a lot of time with. But at the end of the day, what I'd like to recommend in this particular case is that you lean heavily on education to build trust. In other words, once you get really, really specific about figuring out who your ideal clients are, and again, it's very, very different. That's why I said the first split is you want to figure out if you want to be in the hyperscale or the co-location business. If you're in the hyperscale business, there may be as little as 10, 20, 30 potential buyers for that particular location, which is the bad news. The good news is you can invest very, very aggressively in developing each and every one of those opportunities. If you're selling retail co-location, depending on where you're located, there's a couple hundred or maybe a couple thousand potential clients. So you need to use a lot of one-to-many. And where I'm very partial to one-to-many is at this stage of the game for your first sales hire in this particular context, make sure that they're super comfortable, super proficient on LinkedIn. And in terms of, 10 years ago, it was a nice to have to be good at what people would call social selling, or just in general being good at sharing helpful, useful, educational content on LinkedIn and having a good book of business, a good set of LinkedIn connections from their previous career experiences that helps to spread this content. But what I'd like to encourage you to do is that person, that first sales hire, should be constantly sharing helpful tips and hints and best practices and behind the scenes videos and PDFs, documents, what they call LinkedIn documents or carousels that show basically what you're doing with building and starting to fit out the data center and how it compares to other alternatives in the market and the different kinds of competitive advantages. A lot of what this would start with is presumably to get the capital to build and operate this facility. You've built a deck, probably multiple iterations of the deck. So what I'd encourage you to do is, as you're taking the version of your investor deck and you're building the version of the prospect deck, is to think about the content strategy that first sales hire can be using to build reach and build visibility from their personal LinkedIn account. Yes, building a company page is important as well, but for several years now, we've known that individual LinkedIn profiles have way more reach than company pages. But there's opportunities to share both and cross-pollinate each other. I would also encourage, as part of this process, I'm very partial to getting events going sooner rather than later on a very regular basis. Once you've figured out that ideal client profile and have that list of targeted accounts, and the primary core buyer persona or two that you really want to be targeting, I want to get really deep in the weeds on understanding what's going on in their world. These customer insights are worth their weight in gold. In other words, figuring out, let's say, for example, in this particular case, you are selling to a VP of IT of a mid-market company as your primary, and your secondary buyer persona may be the CIO of an enterprise manufacturing company, and your tertiary buyer persona, the owner of a small channel partner, a small MSP or bar or something like that. Once you know those three segments, I would encourage you to spend a couple of days digging through primary research. What's the best primary research? Face-to-face conversations. Second best would be video calls, Zoom calls. After that, at the minimum, surveys, at the minimum, studying a stack of their LinkedIn profiles. What's super important in those 2 or 3 segments is to get consensus on their handful of biggest goals that they're working on individually, as a team, as a company, at the intersection of digital infrastructure, specifically around concerns that are directly and indirectly related to AI data centers and where they choose to place their digital infrastructure. In addition to these goals, I also want to know what's driving them nuts, what their biggest struggles and what their biggest challenges are. So we'll end up with 10 or 12 topics for each of these 3 segments: for the VP of IT, for the CIO of the mid-market, of the CIO of the manufacturing company, and the owner of the channel partner, whatever those 3 segments are for you. We're looking for those 10 or 12 topics. Roughly half are goals that they're working on, things that show up in job descriptions and LinkedIn about summaries, and the other part is what's totally driving them nuts, what's causing them to lose sleep, what's causing interrupted vacations, messed up work-life balance, really, really stressing them out at the intersection of digital infrastructure. So for each of those segments, once you know the most commonly heard and the second most commonly heard, one that should give a lot of priority around how you develop your website copywriting. In other words, if you're putting together a website page for each of these 3 segments, as best practices in most cases, the biggest goals, these biggest challenges, are typically going to play a very big role in the copywriting and the headline on those particular website pages. And along the same lines, those 10 or 12 topics should be all over the bullet points in that website copywriting. And your lead generation offers, your downloadable ebook, your downloadable planning guide, your downloadable special report for each of those segments, heavily infused with what you learned from that buyer persona research. And your event strategy, your educational event strategy, should take into account big time what you learned from those 10 or 12 topics, those 5 or 6 big goals and those 5 or 6 big challenges. And for these high value segments, especially higher value parts of standing up a business like this, every single month, like clockwork, run an educational event on one of those 12 topics. So you have 10 or 12 topics, you have 10 or 12 months. Every single month for the next 10 or 12 months, run an educational event. If most of your prospects, most of your future clients, most of your channel partners for your AI data center are located long distance, then these events naturally should be a webinar. Record all of those. There's always going to be a lot more people that intended to attend but weren't able to, or they'll say like, gee, I really wanted my boss, I really wanted my NOC manager, I wanted my CISO, my cybersecurity expert to attend. So it's great to have the slides and the recordings available so they can forward those around. If you have the luxury of most of your clients being located in relatively close proximity to where you're planning on building this facility, then these should be in person. The challenge is when you have a brand new facility that you're constructing, you probably don't have the luxury of having your conference room or classroom in that particular facility built yet. So what I'd encourage you to do is look around in the immediate area within a 1, 2, 3 mile radius, 5-10 minute radius of where your data center is going to be, and find a conference room or classroom that you can cost effectively rent out for an hour or 2 once a month, potentially a couple times a month. If you decide that each of these segments are valuable enough that you want to hit each of these 3 segments once a month, then you're talking about doing a breakfast seminar or lunch and learn or something like that for an hour and a half or 2 hours, the first Wednesday, the second Wednesday, the third Wednesday, and rotating around your 3 different segments. Over time, you'll figure out what's the best day of the week. You'll figure out what's the best time of the day. You can certainly poll people. You can ask about that as you're interviewing people. If you were to come to an educational event like this, what would be the best day of the week? What would be the best time of the day? By the way, also, when I mentioned in passing that if you have the luxury of this being an existing facility to host this in your classroom or conference room, since you're at the stage where you're likely talking about blueprints as a new AI data center builder and operator, one of the best things that you can possibly do for your sales leader, for your sales team, for your marketing team, is to make sure to carve out roughly 1,000 square feet in that facility for a really nice classroom, for a really nice conference room, for a really nice area where you can have events on a very, very regular basis. Because once you get up and running, I already pretty quickly got dibs on 3 half days a week right there. But what usually ends up happening, if you really want to get good value, with dozens of great people coming in and out of your facility and some of them wanting tours and becoming prospects, it's super common to find data center builders, data center operators to allow user group meetings, to invite user groups and meetups and things like that to happen in that space in your facility. Because what's more awesome than the local Microsoft Azure, or Google Cloud, or Cisco, or Red Hat, or Proxmox, whatever it is, to have a local meetup in your meeting room, in your conference room, quarterly, monthly, whatever it is. And if you really want to score extra points, be the sponsor of it. The interesting part is a lot of times when people give me objections for why they can't do this stuff, I talk about what they're currently doing. And we go through and we discover that 25 to 30 times a year, they're flying across the country, potentially flying to another part of the world to have a booth at a national or global data center conference at tremendous, tremendous expense. Even attending, even 1 or 2 people from your team attending a conference that requires out-of-town flights and hotel and travel and entertainment and everything like that is at minimum of 5 or 10,000 or your local currency equivalent. The only way you get off for less is if they're going to single day local events, which there are some of them, and they're usually a smaller audience. They can be okay. But if you're already doing national or global, you may be spending anywhere from 5 or 10,000 up to, if you have a booth or you're sponsoring that event, $50,000, $100,000 or more into that event. The interesting part with hosting very focused educational events specifically for your ideal client profile that are very, very laser focused on the perfect people from the perfect accounts and the perfect context, where they see you as an expert, where they see you as an educator, a trusted advisor, a consultant. The interesting part is when you're hosting your own events, compared to the cost of national conferences, it's virtually nothing. What do I mean by virtually nothing? Well, you already have the real estate, right? You're just signing up to reserve your conference room or your classroom from 8:30 to 10 a.m. or 8:30 to 11 or whatever it is, or 11 to 1 if it's a lunch and learn or something like that, once a month, twice a month, 3 times a month. Maybe you have some wonky internal chargeback system that requires that there's a little bit of soft cost, but usually it's very close to zero. More than likely, I sure hope you have a CRM system, a customer relationship management system, and an email marketing program to stay in touch with your prospects and clients. So those are all sunk costs. Those basically cost free. When it comes to putting together a 30 or 45 minutes educational presentation with a subject matter expert in your company, again, we're just talking about time. Sometimes you need a little bit of executive sponsorship motivation for that person to want to participate and share their best practices and great institutional knowledge with prospects and clients. That's an alignment, executive sponsorship kind of problem. So when it comes to your out-of-pocket costs, when you're inviting 15, 20 people to come to a breakfast seminar or 20, 30 people to come to a lunch and learn event, when you're hosting it in your own facility, your cost is almost nothing. What are you talking about? Bringing in like bagels and fruit, pastry and coffee in the morning, or bringing in like some pizza or salads or sandwiches or something for lunch. It's a few $100s or your local currency equivalent. There's no $8 cups of coffee in the hotel or $12 cups of coffee in the convention center. None of that. It costs very, very little. So your excuse for not going all in on this is usually just a matter of prioritization and making this something on the front burner. And because it costs so little, this is the reason why you can and likely want to be running these on a very regular basis, because it flips the script. It turns the tables around and gets you out of the vendor box. So instead of being seen as a stereotypical account executive or sales developer who's trying to fill up a data center, you're putting together this world-class educational experience where the topics, the speakers are so good that you're highly confident that if this speaker went to a national conference and presented the exact same 30, 45-minute talk, that they would have one of the highest rate, he or she would have one of the highest rated sessions of the entire conference. No infomercials allowed, no hard pitch, no hard selling allowed. This is strictly all about educating and building trust, taking those 10 or 12 big goals and challenges that you've identified for each of those segments and systematically, one at a time, once a month for the next 10 or 12 months, and having a fantastic educational experience. When they register, they get back an email that says, who else should attend? We know that when it comes to digital infrastructure for mid-sized manufacturing companies, it's truly a team effort. It takes a village. There's usually people involved from support, from operations, from cybersecurity, from compliance, finance. So given that, who else from your team and other stakeholders within your company would benefit from attending? Simply hit the forward button, add a thought or two on why this matters, and we know the teams that learn together grow together. And that's a really, really important foundational part for your sales team as well. As when you start to see multiple people from the same company registering and learning together, you're proactively driving alignments in the formative stages of the journey, in the early and the middle stages of the journey, where you have a real opportunity to shape the criteria that they use to evaluate other competitive options. And you'll know this is working because each time when they get to part 2, part 3, part 4 in the series, you start to notice from the same companies, you have more and more people from the same companies attending. So you're gradually meeting multiple people from the decision committee from that same company. This is a beautiful, beautiful way to implement account-based marketing, ABM, or account-based selling, where there's an entire decision committee that you're trying to shape and influence how they pursue this particular initiative around choosing AI data center infrastructure. So that's what I'd be thinking about for improving sales. The traditional definition of a salesperson is changing quite dramatically. Your salesperson is no longer just in competition with other salespeople for the last 10 years. They've been in competition with digital journeys where people were self-serving and getting information from search and social and watching YouTube videos and listening to podcasts and attending webinars. And that still is all very much an issue. But in the self-service journey, where as much as 85, 90% of the research and decision-making process is over before your sales team meets someone, your sales professionals are in competition with ChatGPT for attention, and Copilot and Gemini and Perplexity and Claude and Grok. And to the extent that they can get immediate gratification from those generative AI tools, we need to do one better. And that's a big part of the reason why we see so many sales teams in the data center ecosystem now hiring experts that look a lot like that are a lot more like peers of the buyer persona, of their core buyer personas. So you're calling on CTOs. You want to ideally get someone in a business development and account executive role who's a former CTO or worked for a CTO, either directly or in that person's organization. So that person is seen as a peer of the people that they're calling on. Selling to engineers, the same thing. Be fantastic to have that person as an account executive, sales developer, business developer come from an engineering background because they know the issues, they know the language, they know the ecosystem. They're probably bringing a nice, impressive book of business, list of industry contacts along with them from their previous jobs, from their previous coworkers over the years. So that's how you get your sales team out of the vendor box and to be seen more like a teacher, a consultant, a trusted advisor, a subject matter expert. Does that mean that everyone that you hire needs to be able to be the primary subject matter expert who's doing all this teaching? In a perfect world, it'd be nice if they can do some of it, but more than likely, even in a relatively small early stage company, there should be multiple people on your team who'd be in a position to share some expertise that would be interesting to your core prioritized buyer persona. So this is, again, a matter of studying their goals and challenges that you surface through your customer insight research as you build out the buyer personas, and then looking at your team's LinkedIn profiles and starting to match up and say like, oh, they're really interested in cybersecurity. Our CTO is a they're certified in this. They've had direct responsibility for this over the years. Let me match that up. Oh, our head of engineering, they're really into liquid cooling. They're looking into direct to chip and the differences between hot dial, cold dial. They've done all that in their career. It'd be fantastic when we bring in engineering audiences to talk about that. Oh, our secondary persona, we're manufacturing. Oh, we actually have our NOC manager. 2 jobs ago, it was 8 or 10 years ago, but they actually spent a few years running an IT organization for a small manufacturing firm. Bingo. So this is the connecting of the dots that makes for having a world-class educational program. And if you exhaust your internal subject matter experts, go to your channel partners, go to your consultants, go to your vendors, and see how you can plug the gap with all of that. From a sales perspective, your sales professional don't necessarily need to be the primary teacher. They could be the tour guide, the concierge, the host, the moderator that brings all of this together. But make no mistake, the way to get a foot in the door in that first 83% of the sales, very, very sales allergic buyer's journey is to change things around so you're part of their professional development and learning and development. And the sooner you do that, the more successful your sales team is going to be. So that's what I'd be thinking about for developing a sales strategy, running a sales playbook for improving sales for a new AI data center builder and AI data center operator. If you're getting good value so far from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you help spread the word, help share the love by hitting the like button on whatever platform you're watching on. If you're listening and you have the opportunity to rate and review that, we'd love to get your review as well. And if you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you'd like to see us address in an upcoming show, be sure to drop that in the comments and we'll add that to the consideration queue. So what's up next? Okay, so now we're going to move over into the data center facility side of the data center ecosystem, where the data center industry is organized into operators, technology companies, facilities companies, construction, real estate, and investment companies, and outsourced sales and marketing. So our next question is all about facilities. How can we improve a data center heat reuse, positioning, and sales strategy? How can we improve positioning and sales strategy for a company that's focused on data center heat reuse? So most of the companies that are early on in evangelizing and developing and promoting data center heat reuse have a couple of things in common. In most cases, they're data center operators that have decided not to brand themselves as data center operators because their sustainability mission is so radically different than how traditional data center operators present. Second, the companies that are all in on heat reuse, on waste heat reuse, tend to be located in regions of the world where there are sustainability directives, where there's government regulation that's encouraging either by carrot or by stick for more widespread adoption of taking some of the heat that's generated from the data centers and figuring out how to funnel that back into something else that benefits the community. And most of the early use cases for heat reuse, the excess heat is being used to heat water. In the case of heating swimming pools and community pools and health clubs and similar facilities like that. And I've had on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast, I've interviewed two members of the founding team, the CEO and the CMO of Deep Green in the UK, who's doing really, really innovative best practices, building the global playbook on how to build a sustainable business where the data center operator is partnering with community organizations that have a use case for heating these community pools and might be seen as a little bit of a luxury, but there's a lot of research on people that use these community pools having much better health outcomes, safety outcomes, whole bunch of social good things tied to getting more people swimming year round, where depending on where you're located, it may be completely impractical to swim in a swimming pool for most of the year if you live in a colder climate. Another interesting use case on heat reuse, also with hot water, is hot showers. Or heat in general in a building that's located adjacent. So far, most of these use cases around waste heat reuse for data center operators require that the building that's going to benefit from the excess heat be located right next door, be located adjacent to the data center facility. So this is the argument for decentralization of data centers, having the data centers be located as close as possible to where there's a need and interest in being able to offload that heat and use it for another purpose. So there's this grid. A lot of it too is in a lot of cities, there are centralized grids that run heat during the year as opposed to one-off signing up for a utility company and being on your own for heat. So in a lot of cases, they're partnering with the utilities to be able to take that particular heat reuse. Another interesting use case that we're seeing a little bit more in Scandinavia, in particular in Sweden, is the idea of a greenhouse, agricultural use, right next to a data center. So if you think about like in Scandinavia and Sweden, where the winters can be kind of cold, right? And you want to be able to grow certain fruits and vegetables year round in a greenhouse. If the greenhouse is located right next to a data center, you can essentially heat the greenhouse all the months where heat is needed, which would be a significant part of the year, from the excess heat that's coming off of the data center. And there's I've had a couple of interesting guests on the data center go-to-market podcast as well from Sweden that are doing exactly that. Scandinavian data center, Svante Horn, T-Loop, Cecilia Yertzel, and more on the research side on establishing standards both for Sweden and on a global basis, John Summers from RISE, the Research Institute of Sweden. So what's core with all of this to recognize is this is concentrated so far in 2 countries within Europe. Actually, I had someone from Norway as well. It was a similar kind of approach. We've heard of some projects like this happening in Singapore, and there's some very, very early conversations about planning these kinds of projects in a couple places in the US. I think one's San Jose, California. I think there's a small project in Atlanta, Georgia. The general consensus when I speak with people in Europe and the US about this is where it's most likely to take off is where those district heating grids are ready and there's cold winter climates. In other words, far more likely that you're going to hear about the first data center heat reuse happening in Minneapolis, Minnesota, as opposed to Miami, Florida, or Boston, Massachusetts, as opposed to Southern California or something like that. So in terms of positioning and sales, like I mentioned when I first started answering this question, most of the data center operator companies that are going all in on heat reuse are nearly all of their branding on their mission and their vision and their values about sustainability and heat reuse. Second, most are also realizing that there's a unique opportunity to build something very, very different. And as a result, they're throwing away a lot of the traditional conference heavy, opposite of sustainability practice of flying to conferences and shipping truckloads of swag in and out of these and all the things that are kind of the opposite of sustainability. So in many cases, you see innovation around hosting their own events. You see innovation around hosting webcasts, podcasts, positioning, being involved in establishing the standards on a global basis. And much in the same way that the decentralized data center location requires a thoughtful process on urban planning, these are the same groups of companies that are a lot more receptive to the idea of, instead of going to a national conference where thousands of people are attending and less than 10% of the people are the right prospects, so there's 90% waste. This is the same core group that says, well, of those 90% waste, of those 3,000 people that are attending, there's only 300 people that I really cared about meeting anyway. And I'm competing for attention with 50 or 75 speakers and 100 other vendors. What if I took that same list of 300 people and I tried to get those 300 people to attend a couple of webinars or attend a couple of breakfast seminars and lunch and learns with our subject matter experts over the next several months? You're a lot more targeted, a lot more focused, a lot more about value, a lot more about educating and building trust, because we're in a new category, and innovation with marketing and sales is super, super important as well. So in terms of improving that positioning and in terms of improving that sales, I think it's also very conducive to very specific kinds of channel partners. Now, a traditional data center operator would look to conventional managed service providers and integrators and value-added resellers for filling out their channel partner ranks. A company that's focused on data center heat reuse is a lot more likely to partner with companies and organizations that are focused on sustainability and decarbonization, and that are very, very tightly aligned with the value of the true differentiator in all of this, the heat reuse. And along the same lines, that will almost certainly bring a much substantial PUE improvement, a much lower cost of running that particular facility. But first and foremost, they're looking for like-minded. So the traditional sales professional that's been selling for a data center operator for years, for decades, there's a certain playbook that they've used for years, and a lot of that playbook is being called onto them out a lot less effective in a world where so much of the buyer's journey is now self-service. So the sales professionals that are surviving and thriving in that environment are looking a lot more like teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, perhaps even thought leaders. This is basically mandatory for a company that's focused on something as innovative, something as different, something as disruptive as data center heat reuse, where the people that you're hiring way, way, way more than just opening up new deals and sales opportunity generation and getting revenue over the finish line are ambassadors of your brand. And a core part of your brand is that sustainability mission. So in much the same way that CEOs and chief revenue officers and chief commercial officers are now looking for a certain kind of sales hire that looks a lot like their peers for their core accounts that they're calling on, this would be the same basic issue. So the ideal person in a sales role, in an account executive role, in a business development role for a company that's focused on data center heat reuse will likely come from a background where sustainability has been a core part of what they did in their previous career. Now, getting someone that has 10 years of experience in data center heat reuse, let's be realistic about it. There really has not been a commercial business for data center heat reuse for 5 or 10 years. This is when people talk about the absurdities that they see in job descriptions, where they want someone with 25 years of experience integrating ChatGPT into AI tech stacks. Like 25 years of experience. ChatGPT just came out of beta at the end of 2002, right? So how could they have 25 years of experience? That's crazy. But what we tend to see is a lot of non-traditional hires. Like a perfect example, I interviewed someone from Siemens in Singapore last year, Patricia Alvina, who was working with data center operators and enterprise data centers on sustainability initiatives. And Pat came from a background of being an engineer, of having a career experience in academia and consulting companies, specifically around sustainability and environmental sustainability, and applying that into different kinds of mission critical environments. And Pat moved to EchoSense a little while back, kind of extremes of Siemens being a huge global conglomerate and EchoSense being more of like a emerging scale up, more mid-market kind of company where you can likely have a lot more roadmap impact than a much larger company. But again, I'm seeing across the board, regardless of whether we're talking about data center operators or technology or facilities companies or construction or real estate, is the traditional sales hire with that playbook is largely going out the window. And what people are very strongly leaning towards is they don't want to just specialize by geographic or company size or life cycle stage. They want to specialize with getting someone who is a subject matter expert, who is a consultant, who would be seen as a peer or an expert by the very prospects and clients that they're calling on. So in this particular case, the ideal sales hire for heat reuse is someone that's worked in an environment where, if it's not heat reuse, it's something that would be a first cousin of that, like energy optimization, building monitoring, building management, something around measuring and optimizing efficiency, something that's very, very closely related, where it's highly likely that people that they worked with, either as coworkers or as clients or prospects or partners or sat on boards or committees with in the past, would be either directly or indirectly related to who they're going to be working with going forward. So really, really deeply embedded in that ecosystem. So at a company level and an individual level, both at the account level and the contact level, that's what I'd be thinking about for how to improve data center heat reuse positioning and sales. is be open to the idea of a very non-traditional approach to positioning, because what you're doing is potentially so disruptive relative to traditional data center operators. And on the sales side, on the marketing side, I would lean also into the same idea of being very focused on educating and building trust and leading with that, as opposed to a traditional lead generation approach. And just like your company is essentially a data center operator with the sustainability layer born in heat reuse, it's going to have the same thing. You will essentially still need people to set up your website, optimize conversion paths, build premium content, host podcasts, host webinars, host in-person events. All of that is still necessary. But what's even more necessary is building your team with members, one, that collaborate and partner really, really well together to succeed and thrive in the self-driven journey. But second, that are very, very deeply resume attached and emotionally attached and bought into the mission of your company, and how that plays out into a very non-traditional approach to positioning what it is that they are working on with the ecosystem. So that's what I'd be thinking about for how to improve a company's approach to data center heat reuse in terms of positioning and sales strategy. Okay, what's up next? How do we market and sell data center technologies that improve efficiency and speed? How do we market and sell data center technologies that improve efficiency and speed? So we're now back in the technology part of the data center ecosystem, where at DCSMI, we catalog 22 different kinds of data center technology related companies: hardware, software, storage, networking, cabling and connectivity, cybersecurity. So when it comes to marketing and selling data center technologies and improving efficiency and speed, let's make sure that we're really dialed into and have a lot of clarity around our ideal client profile. And as long as your company is pretty well established and you're long past the stage where you've figured out product market fit and go to market fit, we should be able to look at your homepage and figure out essentially what your ideal client profile is. In other words, the logos, the testimonials, the case studies, the reviews. What does this tell us about the nature of your business and geographically where your ideal clients are located, how big or small their companies are, and what industries they tend to be located within? So there's certain parts of data center technology that are more conducive than others to being able to be delivered long distance without physically traveling to data center facilities. But there's a lot of parts of data center technology that are not conducive to being able to deliver, at least initially, long distance. Now, hardware still can't be shipped over fiber, right? Hardware physically needs to be shipped to the facility. Same thing for storage. Cybersecurity can be largely, there's definitely appliances, definitely some hardware that can involve in that, but a lot of the ongoing monitoring, once there's initially, can be done remotely. Data center management, data center monitoring, same part. There's different, depending on the nature of your business model and how big or small your clients are, there's some parts that are more conducive to being able to deliver over a more expansive, over a broader geographic area than others. But either way, let's get clarity on a single one-page ICP, ideal client profile document, like where they're located, how big or small their companies are. The big or small is an interesting one as well that people don't spend enough time on in a lot of companies initially. The big or small helps to make sure that your sales teams are marketing and selling as efficiently as possible. For the minimum size, that typically lines up with like your entry-level purchase agreement, your entry-level program. So if you know, for example, that for the kind of data center technology that you market and sell, that your entry-level offering requires a $5 million entry-level point, that's going to exclude nearly all small and medium-sized businesses, right? Maybe the large part of mid-market or something like that. I'm just giving an extreme example. However, if your entry-level point is $499 or your local currency equivalent and can be sold by a shopping cart on your website with a self-service sign up, well, then basically there is no minimum. A startup with a single solopreneur founder can easily afford. And then there's usually somewhere in between. So depending on the nature of what your minimum engagement level is, your minimum purchase point is, should be able to figure out how big that company needs to be to afford that. Along the same lines, at the other extreme, for your data center technology, what you provide, at what point does your effectiveness with your product, with your platform currently fall off a cliff as you scale to increasingly larger companies? In other words, is your offering been battle tested? Are you able to provide equal value to a Fortune 50 company, a Fortune 500 company, as you can to a 5 or 10 person startup company? If you can, fantastic. Then you have a very, very wide range of company sizes you can sell to. But what more than likely ends up happening, and if your company is small or mid-size, there's often prioritization or trade-offs that are thought through as you develop your product roadmap, of deciding like, hey, we're really good with small and medium-sized businesses and in some cases mid-market, but we really haven't had much success with our platform, with our technology in companies that are significantly bigger than 5,000 employees. Okay, well, now we're getting somewhere. So with that in mind, maybe your ideal client profile says that you want to be marketing and selling to companies that have at least 50 employees, but no more than 5,000 employees. That helps. Okay, we've narrowed down geographically where we're marketing and selling. We've narrowed down company size. Industry is also a pretty big deal a lot of times with data center technology. Why? Because in a lot of parts, a lot of segments, a lot of niches within data center technology, when you overlay a geographic location with a certain industry, a lot of times you end up in a situation where there's regulation. And that regulation a lot of times forces issues with accreditation and compliance and certifications. And if you have those for a particularly regulated industry, that's great. You should be explicitly noting that as something to include and focus on in your ideal client profile. If along the same lines, you know that there's something that a government account or a financial services account or a healthcare account keeps asking you for, and you're just not able to deliver it today for that kind of company, that should be noted as well as an exclusion. These inclusions and these exclusions are a really, really big deal to help you improve your efficiency and help you improve your speed, because you're getting rid of a lot of waste that comes about with marketing and selling and lead generation and nurturing and qualifying. What do I mean by this? Once you have a lot of clarity on geographically where your ideal clients are located, how big or small their companies are, the perfect industries, the train wreck industries to stay away from, that will help you to develop a website and have copywriting and top and bottom navigation and the right kind of lead generation offers that are optimized for that particular kind of person. The company size and the geographic targeting will become super relevant if you decide to, or in most cases, when you decide to, because it's a huge part of the playbook for this kind of business, when you decide to do outbound email, outbound prospecting, outbound LinkedIn, that's super targeted on a very specific ideal client profile and a very specific prioritized buyer personas and what you learn from the customer insight research. So yeah, geography plays a huge, huge role in that, company size as well. And you may decide to not only segment by buyer persona, you may decide to segment by company size within that buyer persona. What do I mean by that? Well, the IT manager of a 200-person large small business that has maybe 1 or 2 employees has a very different daily routine than the VP of IT of a Fortune 1000 bank that has 300 people working in their IT organization. So think about the 3-person IT organization compared to the 300-person IT organization. Like, oh yeah, they're going to want different things, right? Absolutely. So different copywriting, it's probably a different feature set. And certainly the IT organization with 3,000 people is certainly a huge order of magnitude difference than the 3-person IT department. So you may decide to even segment by not only by buyer persona, but by company size for more efficiency and speed. But all of this Once you have clarity on that ideal client profile, that should help you to build out your target account list of the perfect ideal companies that you'd love to have as a future client in your company a couple months out from now, 6 months to a year out from now, whatever your sales cycle is, and to directionally focus everything that you're doing with your marketing and your lead generation and sales enablement, sales strategy going forward. And so instead of trying to boil the ocean, you're what people would say like spearfishing. You're going after very, very specific 100 accounts, 500 accounts, 1,000 accounts, whatever makes the most sense for your unit economics and your coverage and your territories with what you're doing with your sales hiring. But at the end of the day, I'm very, very partial for data center technologies to figure that out. And even when it comes to industries, I'd also like you to think through if you're selling primarily to data center operators or enterprises that have their own data centers. Because an enterprise that has their own data centers may look at your category very different than a data center operator that has hundreds of different companies that they're responsible for. Along the same lines, a co-location operator with hundreds of different companies that they're responsible for may make very different decisions in your category compared to a hyperscale data center operator that has one huge anchor tenant or 2 or 3 huge clients or something like that they're responsible for across their location portfolio. So all of these considerations come into account in a big time way. But once you have that figured out, we live in a world now where most IT buyers, most engineering buyers don't want to spend a lot of time with salespeople anymore. It used to be 10 years ago that they would get about halfway through their research and decision-making process, and they'd say like, okay, yeah, now I'm ready to talk to sales. I'll schedule a free needs assessment, a consultation. I'll come in and I'll take the tour. 10 years ago, CEB, the corporate executive board that's now owned by Gartner, did some really important research with Salesforce and SiriusDecisions. And at the time, they found that typically 56, 57% of a journey was over before vendor contact or sales contact. That wasn't too bad. Your prospects and clients would be doing tons of research on search engines and asking questions on social media, watching YouTube videos, listening to podcasts, attending webinars. They'd get 56, 57% of the way there. And they'd be like, okay, I've taken this as far as I can. Now I'm ready to talk to someone from your sales team. You didn't realize how easy you had it at the time, but that's now very much a point of nostalgia in the rearview mirror. The 56, 57% number has jumped all the way to 83%. In other words, Gartner is now finding most of the journey is happening without you in the room, 83% of the way done before you get to meet a prospect or client. And that's a huge, huge deal, because even if you do everything perfectly, you're only in there for the final 17%. That doesn't give you much time to shape the criteria that they use in your category. Imagine you're the general manager of a sports team, and for whatever reason, you're not allowed in the arena. You're not allowed on the field. You're not allowed in the stadium until the game is 83% of the way over. So for baseball, what would that be? You'd be into the 7th inning already before your team is allowed to take the field. For football, for basketball, for soccer, you'd be deep into the 4th quarter already. In other words, the game is nearly over. The other team is completely trounced over your team. You don't even have a chance to compete. You're completely invisible. That's what the self journey looks like. And it's a huge, huge challenge for a lot of companies that are running a very traditional playbook. But it's also a big opportunity for you if you can get your mind around what your prospects and clients are really craving. Because even though they're incredibly sales allergic, they'd much prefer to spend time talking with Gemini and ChatGPT and Copilot as opposed to a member of your sales team. The one thing they still crave is professional development and learning development. They still need to keep their skills sharp. So to the extent that you can become a part of your prospects and clients' professional development and learning and development, you'll get to spend a significant amount of that first 83% with them. The challenge for a lot of very traditional old school companies in this space is they can't get their mind around the fact that the world has changed. They understand that the world has changed and AI is now a big deal. They understand that GPUs create crazy amounts of heat, and traditional hot aisle, cold aisle is not going to cut it. That's why liquid cooling is such a big deal. They understand the power requirements are just off the charts. They understand all of that. But when it comes to being self-aware about what your prospects and clients want from your company, it's complete burying the head in the sand, which is an enormous, enormous problem, because your prospects and clients just don't want to spend a lot of time with salespeople anymore. There's so many much more efficient, much more pleasant ways for them to get access to that information, but they still need to learn. So To the extent that your marketing and sales feels a lot more like education, you can spend a significant amount of that 83% with your ideal prospects and clients. So what does this look like in practice? Say for your data center technology company, you've identified 3 different segments: a primary, a secondary, a tertiary buyer persona. And each of those segments have 10 or 12 topics that are top of mind, 5 or 6 big goals, 5 or 6 big challenges that they're struggling with. For each segment, those 10 or 12 topics, think of that as your topic of the month. For the next 10 or 12 months, once a month, tackle one of those topics and host a fantastic educational event. For a data center technology company, it's very possible that most of your prospects are long distance. So that educational event may likely be a webinar. Of course, record the webinar for the 50, 60% of the people that wanted to be there but weren't able to, or that want to share the recording and the slides with their coworkers. If you have the luxury of a significant amount of your prospects and clients being located near where you have an office or showroom location or factory location or something like that, where you have a nice classroom or conference room, host these webinars in person. Call it a breakfast seminar, call it a lunch and learn or something similar to that. But the idea is that we are turning completely on its head the idea of vanity metrics and chasing after these really expensive national conferences where, yes, there's 3,000 people, but yes, only 2% of those 3,000 people, only 60 of those 3,000 people are the right people. Well, what if we really want to spend 45 minutes with those 60 people and we want it to happen early and often throughout the full journey? It's a much, much, much more cost-effective and efficient way to do this is to invite those 60 people to our world-class educational program that we're going to host once a month, every month for the next 10 or 12 months. And we're not going to have to bribe them and beg them and control them and manipulate them to spend time with us. They're going to want to, because we've listened very carefully to what's going on in their world. And we've developed this world-class educational events calendar that shows them exactly what they need to help them do their job better for a person in a very specific job function, in a particular geographic region of a company size in a specific kind of industry. So this is the argument for why, if you have 3 prioritized segments, a primary, secondary, a tertiary buyer persona, why don't try to talk to the CFO like it's a CTO. Don't try to talk to the founder, the technical co-founder, as if they're the CTO of a 3,000 employee company or something like that. Be very aware of what your most important segments are and customize and personalize the heck out of this. And to the extent that you already have the classroom, the conference room, you're not paying rent for that. You're not paying for $8 and $12 cups of coffee. You're not paying crazy amounts of travel. You can do this on a pretty regular basis. And you'll know you're doing this well when you start to see multiple people from the same company coming together. Of course, you prompted them and said, hey, who else should attend? We know when it comes to cybersecurity best practices or storage array density or getting more value from your storage investments or your software investments. It takes a village. There's typically people involved from these 3 or 4 disciplines. So with that in mind, who else would benefit from attending? You'll know, again, it's working well when you see multiple people from the same company on your target account list registering and attending together. And you'll know you're doing really well when by month 2, month 3, month 4, you start to see more people from that same company coming together, because the first event or 2, they went back to their coworkers and said, dude, you missed this. This was awesome. You got to come to the next one. They're like, sure, sign me up. And that's how you meet multiple members of the decision committee. And sometimes what even ends up happening is by the 3rd or 4th event, there's half of the people in your 20-person conference room are from the same company. They take you aside like, we're like half the room. Why don't you just come in? We're doing an offsite next Thursday. Why don't you come in and do your whole presentation in front of the entire organization, in front of the entire company, whatever is relevant to that particular construction. Like, cool, I got the foot in the door. So that's at the end of the day what we're looking to do. We're looking to educate and build trust, get the heck out of the vendor box, stay out of the vendor box, and be in a place where we can really shape the criteria throughout the full journey, early and often. Early as possible, as often as possible, to saturate as many of those 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decisions. So that's what I'd be thinking about for how to market and sell data center technologies that improve efficiency and speed. I would let the educational events do the heavy lifting with all of the use cases and the best practices around how your company excels at giving your ideal clients, giving your prioritized prospects and clients what they want out of their technology in terms of dramatically improving efficiency and dramatically improving speed. So I've talked about both sides of this, how to improve your efficiency and speed by positioning yourself as a thought leader and leaning heavily into educational events experiences. And we've also talked about how you can infuse efficiency and speed into the messaging and the content and the educational events that you use, if that's what's coming up high when you do your customer insight research for that particular segment. Don't go all in on efficiency and speed in the messaging there if your customer insight and research tells you something completely different. Remember, we want the goals and challenges in their own words, not what we think the words are, but what the words actually are, because we've taken the time to do our homework. When we use their words, we resonate. We come across as extremely empathetic, as someone that truly gets it and that can truly help them overcome their biggest struggles and reach their big, hairy, audacious professional goals that they need to achieve individually, as a company, and as a team that align with success in their particular job in and around either being a data center operator or managing a data center for an enterprise that has its own data centers. So we're going to take a real quick break from a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's show, we'll come back with 3 more of the biggest data center go-to-market sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about throughout the global data center ecosystem.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com. Now, back to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A.
Hey there, Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and you're watching the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you'd like to see us address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that on the comments on whatever platform that you're watching on, and we'll add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming show. And if you're listening to this program and you have the opportunity to rate and review us, we'd appreciate you doing that as well. So what is up next? Now we're going to dive into the facilities and supply chain side of the data center ecosystem, in particular, how an EPC firm, an engineering, procurement, and construction firm, efficiently generates leads. So how does a data center engineering, procurement, and construction firm, EPC firm, efficiently generate leads? So the first place to recognize is that typically the companies that hire EPC firms are not small. In other words, if you look at data center operators, there are still some, it doesn't happen as often now. It's very rare that you see data center operators that are opening as single location, co-location operators now in present time, and they're just going to stay as single location, co-location operators. In other words, they're either not opening at all or they're coming to the table with enough capital to be multi-location out of the gate, just because they recognize that the capital, the level of business model sophistication, the brand, all of the above is so different today than it was as recently as 10 years ago. Most of the co-location operators that you see today that are single location or 1 or 2 locations were typically started several years ago in the pre-AI era, where it was a lot less expensive to get into the co-location business and a lot less complicated to get into the co-location business. The reason I say this is a significant amount of the couple thousand of co-location operators are very small businesses. And in nearly all cases, they're not going to be prospects for an engineering, procurement, and construction firm unless they're extraordinarily well capitalized and are doing something really, really unique. Like, for example, if you have a data center operator who's really well capitalized and they're going all in on liquid cooling and building a real extreme high density AI data center, then yeah, they for sure could benefit from having a relationship with an EPC firm. But a co-location operator that's been in business for 10 or 15 years and they're about to get marginalized out because they just don't have enough power. They can't support enough density. A lot of the clients that they have are clients of last resort, where they're clients that are coming to them because they're the cheapest option in town, and they like the idea that they can have direct access to the owner, and they can pull a lot of shtick on the data center operator that they can't pull with a larger data center operator, or all of the above. Yeah, those are not going to be the ideal clients for a EPC firm. But over time, your website almost certainly gives the clue. Your case studies, your testimonials, your reviews, your logos will tell us, like, geographically where you're focusing on, how big or small these typical clients are, what industries they tend to be located in. For engineering, procurement, and construction, it is possible to scale a business like that globally, but you'd need to be a very large business yourself to be able to scale that globally. So most of the EPC firms that we come across are national in scope. They're either full US, or they're full country or two or something like that within Europe or some other region. Or if they're considerably smaller, they may only be operating within a region. Like in the US, maybe they focus on the Midwest or the Mid-Atlantic or New England or something like that. So once you have that clarity on your ideal client profile, and you figured out how big or small these companies are, we talked about why really small businesses probably are not going to be a good fit to afford your minimums for an EPC firm. But what about the extreme upper end of the range? As an EPC firm, is your firm big enough that you could legitimately do EPC work for Microsoft or Alphabet or Meta or Oracle or something like that? Or do you reach a point of diminishing returns where you're just not going to be effective at a company that's got more than, say, 5,000 employees or something like that, a very small enterprise or a large mid-market kind of thing? So only you can answer that question based on your historical experience of where you've been most effective, what's been most profitable for you to market, sell, and service over time, where they've gotten the best value, where they've been the best referenceable accounts. But that certainly should be in place. Your ideal client profile should certainly be in place before you worry about generating leads. So clarity on where they're physically located, how big or small their companies are, and perhaps some clarity around business model, industry would be in order as well. At the absolute minimum, think about, are you equally effective as an EPC firm with a data center operator and an end user client, or you tend to do better with one or the other? And there's a lot of companies that are facilities related that over time figure out that, like, we love working with operators, but it's really tough to have for an end user data center with its own data centers to get enough value from us, or vice versa. Maybe you're fantastic with enterprises with end users that own their data centers, but it's just too complicated for your firm to get your mind around a data center operator. Or maybe you do really well with data center operators, and there's a distinct difference between your effectiveness with co-location providers as opposed to hyperscale providers, like a retail co-location operator that has a dozen locations and hundreds of different discrete clients, compared to a hyperscale operator that has like one huge anchor tenant in each of their 3 or 4 or 5 locations or something like that. Very, very different context when it comes to a lot of decisions that get made around facilities and efficiency and a lot of what you're looking to do. So think through all of that before you start to worry about lead generation. Once you have that figured out, you're essentially taking that one-page ideal client profile. From there, you should be able to build a target account list. If you're skewing towards really large companies, just enterprises with their own data centers, just hyperscale operators, then yeah, you're going to have a shorter target account list, fewer potential clients that you could potentially market and sell to or generate leads from. If you're selling to like high volume data center operators, like a retail co-location provider that has hundreds of different clients across several different locations, then yeah, that's that you need to think about as well. And then within those accounts, who are the key people and what do they care about? What's top of mind for each of them? Figuring out what's top of mind for each of them, getting those customer insights together, is a huge part of your positioning. It's a huge part of your go-to-market strategy. It's a huge part of what the decisions that you make on what goes in your website copywriting, what should be emphasized on your website versus de-emphasized. And it definitely makes a big difference with how you think about your lead generation strategy. Big caveat with all of this is, even among data center facilities related professionals, even among selling to engineers, selling to procurement officers, selling to construction folks like data center developers and larger companies. Even among those folks, there's a very strong bias now towards wanting to self-serve, wanting to be as much in the driver's seat as possible in your category. Meaning that like 10 years ago, it was very common to find like an engineer, a procurement manager, a construction manager in this kind of context. They would do a significant amount of research on their own. They would get about halfway done and they'd be ready to talk to you. 10 years ago, CEB, the corporate executive board, found that roughly half of the journey was over before vendor contact, 56, 57%, which wasn't too bad. But add 10 years of digital transformation to all of this, millions of baby boomers retiring, a lot more Gen Z, a lot more millennials in decision-making roles, tens of millions of people getting used to working from home at the beginning of the 2020s. And that 56, 57% number has jumped to like 83% and continues to accelerate, meaning that their journey, their research and decision-making process is so self-service now that they're almost ready to buy when you're finally looped in. What's picking up all of this gap? What's essentially the competition for attention from your perspective? Well, 10 years ago, it was like search engines, asking questions on social media, watching videos, listening to podcasts, attending webinars. Those are all still very much a thorn in your side, very much competing for attention. Search engines, not as much anymore because a lot of the traditional search is moving to generative AI apps like ChatGPT and Copilot and Perplexity, where you don't have to click on each of the 10 blue links anymore to figure out what the answer is and synthesize all this. You get instant gratification. And that instant gratification is really, really, really what you're competing against, is they're getting such amazing value. They're not being put through the ringer through your prospecting process and being forced to jump through all kinds of hoops. They're getting instant answers to exactly what they want faster than they ever could before. So in a lot of ways, you as a sales professional, as a business developer, as a founder, as an executive who's responsible for growing this kind of EPC business, you're in competition with self-service. You're in competition with these apps. So because of that, they need to get such insane amounts of value from their interactions with you that they feel like they're not talking to a salesperson anymore. They feel like they're talking to a teacher, a consultant, a subject matter expert, a trusted advisor, maybe even a thought leader. So this changes the nature of who you hire. So for an EPC firm, it's increasingly common for new hires in a sales business development role to come from these unique disciplines where they've worked in the engineering part of the data center ecosystem. They've worked on one or both sides of the procurement of supply, logistics and supply chain part of the data center ecosystem. They've worked in a construction role, either for a firm like yours or on the other side for an end user, for a data center operator. And that gives that individual special superpowers to really understand what it's like to do that job, to understand all the jargon, to understand the ecosystem, to understand the different roles, to have street cred, so that when they're having meetings with prospects and clients, that prospect or client feels like they're talking to a peer, not a quota-hungry salesperson. So that changes the nature of who you hire. In terms of like lead generation, how can that person work as efficiently as possible? Well, in a world where people are so incredibly sales allergic, we want to get you out of the vendor box as quickly as possible. We don't want your sales team to be seen as an EPC vendor. We want them instead to be seen a lot more like consultants and experts and trusted advisors. And the best way to do that is for your sales and marketing folks to have world-class educational events experiences, which is a fancy way of saying educating and building trust at scale. And when I bring up the idea of hosting your own events, a lot of times people push back and say, we already go to lots of events. You do. However, it's very possible that some of the events that you're going to may be really chasing your tail. What do I mean by that? Well, when you pull up a particular conference's media kit or prospectus, and you put that on the left-hand side of the screen, and you look at their demographics, and on the right-hand side of the screen, pull up your ideal client profile and your prioritized buyer personas and compare the two. And for each conference where you're making a significant investment, I want you to go through this diligence. And I want you to figure out, is this conference a good match or is it a crappy match? A good match would be a conference where 50, 60, 70% or more of the people attending line up pretty well with your ideal client profile and your prioritized buyer personas. A crappy match would be one where like very little of that conference, maybe 10, 20, 30% of that conference is a fit, and the rest is a complete mismatch with who you want to be spending your time with. That's only part of the equation. Even if the demographics of that conference match up really well with your ideal client profile and your prioritized buyer persona, we need you or someone from your team to be educating and building trust. And at most conferences, let's say a data center conference with 2,500 attendees, there's roughly 3% of the people that are attending that get to educate and build trust. They're the speakers. So 2,500 attendees, 75 speakers, 3%. 3% of the people get to educate and build trust. Now, with most speakers, usually when you're speaking, you're bringing some coworkers along with you. So on average, they're bringing 2 coworkers along with them. Those coworkers benefit very, very directly from their bosses, from their coworkers speaking at that particular event. So when we add that up, maybe it's 225, roughly 250 people out of the 2,500 in attendance. So that's the top 10% of the conference gets to educate and build trust. Another roughly 10%, 20% of the conference is there to staff the booths. They're there to work the exhibit hall. They're the sponsors. Without the speakers, is there even a conference? They're hoping to harvest some of the goodwill that's created by the speakers. And the rest of the people at the conference that are not speaking, that are not a coworker of someone that's speaking, and that aren't exhibiting, the attendees, that's the other 70 or 80% of the conference. And they're essentially the captive audience. No attendees, no booths, no speakers. Seriously, if there's no attendees, who's going to visit the booths? Who's going to sit in the seats at the sessions and learn and be educated and have trust building happening on them? So like, this is what's really, really going on. So if you want to be in a position where you're educating and building trust with the right people in the right places at the right time in the right context, there's 2 variables that are super important. One is making sure their demographics line up really, really well with your ideal client profile and your prioritized buyer personas. And second, making sure that you or someone from your team is on stage speaking, and that you earned the speaking slot, that you didn't buy it, that you actually earned it on editorial merits. That's where it's a really good fit for going all in on national and global conferences. If one or both of those things aren't happening, then I'd encourage you to look at the bottom 20% of your conference investments and redirect. What should it be redirected? From paid events to having your own events. Doesn't mean you need to have a conference. Most people should not have a conference, especially if this is relatively new. But what should be pretty accessible for an EPC firm is saying, okay, there's 300 companies on our target account list, and there's 2 or 3 kinds of stakeholders in each of these 300 companies. So maybe in each account, there's 10 people altogether that we'd like to educate and build trust with. So there's 3,000 people that we want to influence over the next year. How do we educate and build trust with those 3,000 people? Well, if most of those 3,000 people are located within a 30 or 60-minute drive of your location, what I'd love to see happen is a significant chunk of those 3,000 people coming to your breakfast seminars, coming to your lunch and learns, coming to your after hours events. Obviously, if all 3,000 people show up, you're going to need a much bigger classroom or a much bigger conference room, or you just segment this much more granularly. Again, we talked about those 3,000 people for starters being split up among 3 different segments. So let's make some easy math here. There's 1,000 people in each segment. So we invite 1,000 people. Of those 1,000 people, 50 RSVP yes. And of those 50 that RSVP yes, you get a 50% attendance rate. So 25 people attending. That's probably pretty manageable relative to your classroom or conference side. The difference with those 25 people, though, is it's the perfect role at the perfect company. And they're bringing their coworkers along with them as well. So we're influencing the full decision committee. And we have their undivided attention. They're coming to a 90-minute lunch and learn or a 90-minute breakfast seminar. First 20 or 30 minutes is some casual networking, and they have breakfast or lunch. 30 or 45 minutes of the actual formal part of the program. Obviously, it's a small group, so keep it as interactive as possible. But what's super important is this isn't time for an infomercial. This is time for educating and building trust. The slides, the content, what you're teaching, one should align exceptionally well with one of those 10 or 12 big goals and challenges that you found the consensus on for that particular segment. And 2, you need to be so incredibly confident that what they're learning from that session is so amazing that if you presented that exact same session at a national conference, that you're highly confident that you would have one of the highest rated sessions of the entire conference. And there'd be a long line of people standing to talk with your featured speaker right after the session ended that had to be redirected into the hallway because there's such a long line of people that he or she can't get through the queue of the people that are standing waiting for a few moments to talk to them before the next session starts. Everyone wants his or her card. Everyone wants to talk about how you can do business together. And obviously fantastic surveys, fantastic feedback. And 100% of the audience that's there at the beginning of the talk is there. 95% is there at the end of the talk. Very, very few people wandered out over boredom or anything. They're hanging on every word. So with that environment, allow for some Q&A after the talk, and then give a demo or give a tour to people that want to learn more about how they could potentially work with your company, and lather, rinse, and repeat. Bring the right people from the right company in to learn with your stakeholders. In a perfect world, some of your sales and marketing folks can carry a little bit of the load on being the subject matter experts. Even if they can't, then you look to other people within your company who are those subject matter experts who can talk to that particular topic for 30 or 45 minutes. And when you exhaust your internal subject matter experts, go to your channel partners, go to your contractors, go to your vendors, and they can typically supply guest speakers. Not getting the buy-in that you need from your internal subject matter experts, if they're blowing you off, then you have an executive sponsor problem. And what your executive sponsor typically needs to have a message of something along the lines of, we're tired of our salespeople getting jerked around. We're tired of the condescension. We're tired of them being ghosted. We're tired of all this nonsense. We're better than that. We have some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to EPC, when it comes to engineering and procurement and construction. And it's time we let the industry know about that in a really, really big time way, starting with our prioritized accounts, our top 300 accounts over the next year. And we're going to invest in this great initiative. Oh, so we talked about in-person. We talked about virtual. If they're not located in a 30 or 60-minute drive, then deliver the same content over webinars. Always record, always make the slides available. Always know there's going to be multiple people from a particular company who should have been there. Whatever reason, there was a scheduling conflict, or they didn't know about it, or maybe the first time they send one person in to see if it's any good, and then like, oh yeah, then more of us will come the second time around or the third time around. And again, the great part with this is big early and often is you're proactively building consensus. You're really, really dramatically shaping the criteria that they use to evaluate your category in a big time way. So this is the focus on generating leads, nurturing leads, educating and building trust at scale, and completely dominating the surface area, not just in the final 17% of the buyer's journey, but 100% of the buyer's journey, even when there's a very, very strong bias towards self-serve and a tremendous allergy from spending time with people with a sales title or account executives or sales development. Instead, sales and marketers show up as teachers, as consultants, as subject matter experts, trusted advisors, or at the absolute minimum, the moderators, the tour guides, the concierges, the hosts that bring all of those expert resources in together for this kind of world-class educational event where the know, like, and trust should be, when you're doing this the right way, just off the charts. Educate and build trust early and often. So that's what I'd be thinking about for how a data center EPC, engineering, procurement, and construction firm can efficiently generate leads. If you're getting good value so far from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, be sure to hit the like button. And if you have the opportunity to review and rate us on the platform that you're watching, we love that as well. So what is up next? How does a data center sales director build an effective professional network? How does a data center sales director build an effective professional network? That is a fantastic question. It's a great time to be asking this, because a lot of the strategies that sales professionals have used in earlier chapters of their career, if they've been in data center sales for quite some time, are seeing declining effectiveness. And a lot of strategies that they may have underinvested in previous years are becoming so much more important now. A lot of data center sales professionals historically have invested in very traditional playbooks. They've convinced their employers to host a lot of parties, like poolside cabana parties at conferences, sponsoring golf tournaments, taking groups of prospects, groups of clients, groups of channel partners to sporting events like soccer, football, tennis, hockey, baseball, and corporate suites, lots of wining and dining, lots of entertaining. And while you're certain to make a good brand impression when you execute that well, and they will certainly like you from inviting them to that experience, what most of those early efforts at building a professional network don't accomplish is you're not really doing much education and trust building in that context. In fact, if you try to have professional development or learning and development going on in one of those environments, it's not going to be a very fun experience for the people that you invited that thought that they were being wined and dined and schmoozed and they were legitimately getting invited to a baseball game or a concert or a golf tournament or something like that. They don't want you to hand them a workbook and bring out 150 slides and start teaching them about methodology. So the challenge with this is in a world where it's getting increasingly difficult to get surface area, to get FaceTime, not like Apple FaceTime, but like face-to-face time with prospects and clients. The one strategy that's working across the board that has worked for a long time, but just becomes so much more important with today's buyer preferences, is having your sales professionals actively involved in the learning and development and professional development process for your prospects and clients. And usually the first amount of pushback I get is like, so you're saying our prospects and clients are going to learn from our salespeople? Well, they might want to learn from our engineers. They might want to learn from some of our IT professionals, but they really want to learn from our salespeople. It depends. If your sales professionals have spent earlier parts of their career as an IT professional, they likely bring a lot of institutional knowledge that could be useful in a learning and development and professional development context. So this is where we start to see the nature of how companies are hiring for sales roles changing quite a bit. In a lot of ways, if you're in a part of the data center industry that's become commoditized, if it's moved to a large degree to self-service, one of the last ways for you to get a good foot in the door is for your prospects and clients to see you as an expert, to see you as a consultant, to see you as a trusted advisor, to see you as a teacher, and a lot less like a traditional salesperson. So a perfect example would be is, let's say you are a data center integrator or a data center operator, and healthcare is a really important segment for you. What we see happening with increasing amounts of frequency is on your business development team, whether you call it business development, whether you call it a partner in charge of a practice or something like that, we're increasingly seeing hiring people from that exact career experience into your role in a sales and business development role. So if they worked in an earlier part of their career in some kind of IT leadership or some kind of IT support role in healthcare, like for a big hospital group, for a big physician group, for a health tech company. So they not only have great instincts and great command of the jargon and a great set of LinkedIn connections and book of business and industry contacts. It's bigger than that. It's that their prospects and clients see them as one of them. They see your hire as one of them because they essentially are. Because they may not be a peer right now, but roll back the calendar a couple of years and they were a peer. They used to bump into them at all the conferences and they knew of them in that context. So that changes the nature of who you hire. It also changes the nature of how you invest in upskilling and reskilling. With a lot of companies that sell digital infrastructure, a lot of data center operators, we're seeing increasingly sales professionals investing in at least entry-level certifications, training and certifications that put them on par at least with an entry-level or mid-level hire at the clients that they're calling on, because they're expected to operate at a completely different level. Remember, a lot of IT professionals and engineers and other technical buyers are very sales skeptical, very sales cynical, or they're highly educated. And the more highly educated they are, the more sales allergic they are. So what's cutting through the noise is experts. So this came up a little while back. I host the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast, and I interviewed Brandon Pecorello, who at the time was leading business development for DataBank, a big US-based data center operator. And we were talking through, like, what does the sales hire of the future look like? Who's the perfect person for his team? And Brandon was walking through his home lab setup, which essentially is like having a mini data center in his home office. And why does he do that? Because he wants to be as sharp as his prospects when it comes to the core questions that they're going to ask when he takes them on a tour. And I see that just happening so much more often now with the level of upskilling and cross-skilling and retraining that's necessary for sales professionals to insulate their careers against irrelevance and obsolescence in a world where so many of your prospects and clients are now, it's not a matter that they're showing up and being smartasses. It's that they're going much deeper into the journey with self-driven tools than they ever have in the past. They're asking, because they can ask questions so much more efficiently of ChatGPT and Copilot than they did with clicking on 10 blue links, they're coming to the table knowing so much more than they ever have in the past. So in order for you to add value to the process, for them to actually want to spend time with you, as opposed to you having to manipulate and bribe to spend time with them, it's a completely different ballgame now, if you like ballgame analogies, of being able to earn your way in early and often. And the early and the often is so important. If you think about 25 to 30 touch points, you may think that the golf tournament was effective, but the reality is that's just one of 28 touch points. What are you going to do to prevent your competitor from wandering in for the other 27 touch points, or a significant part of that touch point? Now, you don't have to be in there for 100% of the time, but what I really like to encourage sales directors to be thinking about is, on a very regular basis, how can we, especially in strategic accounts, get multiple stakeholders from that same company coming to learn from your experts? It sounds like it might be complicated. It sounds like it might be expensive, but relative to what you're likely already doing at national and global conferences, is actually more simple. And it's certainly way more cost effective. What it largely comes down to is when you have clarity at the account level as to where they're located, how big or small their companies are and their industries are in, that helps you build your target account list. And once you've figured out what's going on at the account level, then we need to segment who are the key people in those accounts into usually 2, 3, 4 different buckets, 2, 3, 4 different segments: a primary, a secondary, a tertiary buyer persona. And among those buyer personas, we need to really understand at a deep level how to walk a mile, how to walk a kilometer in their shoes, what's going on in their world, how to get as client-centric as possible, understanding their top 5 or 6 goals, or their top 5 or 6 challenges in their own words, and then using those words for our website copywriting, for our email marketing, our social media posts, our digital ad strategy, and most of all, our lead generation and events strategy. So once a month, systematically for the next 10 or 12 months, we're tackling each one of those goals and each one of those challenges separately in an educational, professional development, learning and development kind of context. And when we do this well, not only do they sign up and show up, they bring their coworkers along with them. So we start to meet multiple members of the decision committee. So this is how to build an effective professional network. What I see happening by default when people are using a different playbook with this is they go to national conferences, and because they convince their boss to invest $50,000, $150,000, $250,000, whatever it is in this conference or conferences in general, all of a sudden they got to put up numbers to justify that investment. And before you know it, when they couldn't fill up their calendar with 20 meetings from ideal clients, they got like 8 or 10 meetings with ideal clients, and the other 10 or 12 meetings are happening with peers in other companies who might be referral sources. It may also just be socializing. And when they get to really, really bottom of the barrel, they're trying to get a meeting with me. Anyone that can say, oh, first name, last name, I met with this particular person, and they're putting them on the list. Sorry, being a little self-deprecating there. But the idea is, you want to have an effective professional network. You need clarity on that ideal client profile. You need clarity on those prioritized buyer personas, and to be spending most of your time with mostly the right people from the right accounts in the right context, and in a context where they see you as the expert and the trusted advisor, and not just as the vendor. The vendors are commoditized. Huge parts of the data center ecosystem are already heading to self-service commoditization, or they're already there. And for a lot of companies that have waved the flag on this, they have, because either they're building a marketplace, they're listed in a marketplace, they're going all in on channel partners to shift from fixed to variable costs, or doing all of the above and continuing to squeeze their in-house sales team to be more and more effective. And one of the last cards left that you're able to play is the card as the expert and the trusted advisor. So everything about building that effective professional network needs to be a lot more on being super precise about the ideal accounts, super precise about those prioritized buyer personas, and figuring out how you can play a massive, massive role in those prioritized buyer personas: education, their learning and development, their professional development. And if you have the expertise to be able to be part of the sessions, that is fantastic. If you need to lean on internal subject matter experts, product managers, solutions engineers, other folks like that in your company to pull it off, then great. You're the host, you're the moderator, you're the concierge, you're the tour guide. And if you've exhausted your personal expertise and you've exhausted all of your available internal subject matter experts, then go to your vendors, go to your contractors, go to your channel partners, and bring them in as guest speakers. At the end of the day, it's about educating and building trust and using that to transform the belief systems and shape the narrative, to shape how the criteria that they use to establish what they're going to prioritize and what they're going to deprioritize. And then early and often with multiple people from the same company. So you're proactively driving alignments in the formative stages of the buyer's journey, in the formative stages of the sales process, where you have an opportunity to shape their beliefs, as opposed to sitting out the first 83% of the game and immediately treading water in the final 17% because someone else stacked the decks in their favor and shaped the criteria that they're using to judge you against. So that's what I'd be thinking about for how a data center sales director can build an effective professional network. From a tactical perspective, LinkedIn plays an incredibly important role across nearly all buyer personas that are relevant to the global data center ecosystem. Being seen as a thought leader, as a subject matter expert, as a trusted advisor requires being really comfortable with leading educational presentations in person, being super comfortable on camera, presenting videos one-on-one to small groups, webinars, live streams, being on panels, hosting webinars, all of the above. If you don't do this, someone else is going to get in there and they're going to win over your prospects and clients because they're the one that's doing all the education and trust building. So that's a huge, huge part of building an effective professional network as a data center professional in today's hyper-competitive, always-on global data center marketplace. And that brings us to our final question for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. What do we got? How does a colocation cloud and connectivity provider achieve its revenue growth goals? How does a colocation cloud and connectivity provider achieve its revenue growth goals? That is a fantastic question. And the first place we need to start is whenever we get a question where someone's asking about 3 different lines of business that could potentially be sold to the exact same clients or could be sold to different clients, we need to figure that out. A lot of times, data center operator businesses have grown over the years through mergers and acquisitions, M&A. And in some cases, the M&A was really well thought out and there's been fantastic integration. And as a result, it's now a very homogeneous client list. The clients are all largely very, very similar. And it's very straightforward to cross-sell colocation, cloud, and connectivity to the exact same clients. And other cases, the integration hasn't gone as well or it's still in progress. And you have 3 different client bases. For the sake of simplicity, we're going to hopefully go with the idea that you've been well integrated and it's a single client base that you're able to cross-sell these 3 services to. The second place that I'd be thinking about when it comes to revenue growth goals is, do you have a strong sense of product market fit? Do you know exactly the products and services that they buy across your colo, cloud, and connectivity portfolio? Do you know the price points? Do you know the frequencies, the durations, the margins, and the sales cycle, all your basic unit economics? So with that in mind, once you have an idea of what the lifetime value is or the annual recurring revenue from a particular client, we should be able to back into what we need to do early on in the journey at more the upper levels of the funnel to give you that revenue growth goal. So let's say, for example, the revenue growth goal, we're going to use really simple math in this particular case, and we're going to keep the numbers relatively small so I can do these in my head without having to pull up a spreadsheet. But let's say we have a revenue growth goal for a particular team or a particular rep who's selling colo, cloud, and connectivity, and it's a $5 million or your local currency equivalent revenue growth goal. So that $5 million revenue growth goal. And let's say we know that a typical client that's buying Colo, Cloud, and Connectivity from your company is spending $50,000 a year. So 5 million divided by 50,000 a year means we need to add 100 new clients. How are we going to add that 100 new clients? There's a couple of different ways that we can add those 100 new clients. Colo, Cloud, and Connectivity, it's very common to find that there's 3 different ways that Colo, Cloud, and Connectivity can be marketed and sold. The traditional way is you run all of your own marketing and you run all of your own sales. Another way that's become really, really popular over the years is having channel partners, where part of the sales compensation goes to the managed service provider or VAR integrator or agent that brought the business in, and the other part is shared by the channel partner manager on your side that's managing that channel relationship. And then the third is self-service. And in some cases, they're buying directly from your site. In other cases, they're buying from a marketplace. And increasingly, we're going to see more and more companies, especially on low-end entry-level commoditized parts of Colo, Cloud, and Connectivity, going self-service. Not a big surprise that a lot of the big public cloud companies for 10 years at this point, and some of the connectivity companies at this point, are already moving very aggressively in the direction of having their own marketplaces and listing their offerings available for sale on other people's marketplaces. So we have direct, we have indirect, and then we have marketplaces. So the question is, with those 100 clients, what's your split going to be? Is this a split that's being decided by your CEO, by your board? Is this be a split that's being decided and divvied up on your team? But let's say your team needs to generate those 100 new clients with traditional inbound marketing, outbound marketing, and traditional sales. In other words, channel partners are not part of that. That's a complete separate team. And marketplace has nothing to do with you, except that it can, in some cases, if not managed correctly, can drive up your cost and complexity, because it's essentially a form of channel conflict or channel competition if it's not managed right. So with marketing and sales, 100 new clients, what are we going to do? We need to figure out, are all these clients the same? We've already established that. So we get to the point where we have clarity on our ideal client profile. We have clarity on our target account list. And the next thing we need to do is segment that target account list, so we understand if there's different types of people that we're going to want to educate and build trust around Colo, Cloud, and Connectivity. So we'd have a primary buyer persona, a secondary buyer persona, a tertiary buyer persona. If we have a lot of clarity around what we're doing, it's likely that each account has these 3 different roles. There's an IT infrastructure person, there's an operations person, there's a cybersecurity person, whatever it is. There's a channel partners being handled completely separately. So let's say there's an operations, there's a cyber person, there's an infrastructure person, or something like that. So among these 3 segments, we need to figure out, when it comes to how these stakeholders and these companies look at your category, look at Colo, Cloud, and Connectivity, what are their 5 or 6 big goals that they're working on that are directly or indirectly related to Colo and Cloud and Connectivity? And what are the 5 or 6 things that are driving them nuts, their biggest challenges for each of these segments? So we know the answers for infrastructure, we know the answer for cybersecurity, we know the answer for operations, or again, however you're segmenting this up. And then within each of these segments, we want to have a unique website page and a unique lead generation offer, and perhaps a separate email newsletter, and for sure a different event strategy for each one of these segments, so we can really, really resonate. Why is it so important to resonate? Because there's crazy amounts of competition in your category for these stakeholders. Sometimes there's parts of the data center ecosystem that I get questions about on this particular show, and they're small niches, like prefabricated cement construction or something like that, or some aspect of liquid cooling or some aspect of physical security or something like that, where maybe there's 5 or 10 direct competitors and maybe a dozen or 2 dozen indirect competitors or something like that. It's not a huge competitive field. In the case of colocation, cloud, and connectivity, you may have hundreds, if not thousands, of different companies that you're up against. And as a result, you can't afford to market and sell like it's still the 2010s. You just can't. It's so much more complicated. Hyper competition, expectations around immediate gratification, expectations around using generative AI like ChatGPT, Copilot, Perplexity, Claude, Grok to do a complete end run around your sales team. We can't just do plain vanilla marketing and sales anymore. No, we need to get extremely, extremely specific about a specific job role in a specific kind of company that's in a certain geographic region of a certain size and in a particular industry. And the better job we can do with our website pages, with our email marketing, with our social media, with our ads, and certainly with our event strategy, the more likely it is to resonate. The lazier we are, the less likely it is to resonate. Really. Lazy marketing, going to fall completely on deaf ears. And the only exception to this is if you have the luxury of working for a company with a really, really strong existing brand. If you're selling colo, cloud, and connectivity, you have the luxury of doing this from the perch, from the place of at Aquinix.com or at digitalrealty.com, something like that, then yeah, you have a significantly different battle. But for most of the small to mid-sized companies in the space that don't have that luxury, and there's a lot of competition, and there's a brand, but it may not be as strong of a brand as you'd like to, then yes, getting hyper specific about who they are, what they care about, and dialing in everything you're talking about what's top of mind for them is so incredibly important for growing your revenue growth goals. The second part that's incredibly challenging as well is in these three categories, colocation, cloud, and connectivity typically have different durations in terms of the agreement lengths. Colocation, not uncommon to find people locked into 3, 4, 5-year agreements, right? So you could have a fantastic prospect. They love what you're all about. They're dying to move over, but they're in month 4 of 36. So unless something horrific happens with the incumbent provider, they're not going anywhere for another 32 months. Cloud can be a little different. We know for cloud, from a product standpoint, if you're competing against public cloud, that's the beauty of cloud is there can be long-term contracts and credits and everything involved to make long-term commitments, but people's expectation is for a lot more elasticity, for a lot more flexibility around that. And connectivity, somewhere in the middle. The challenge with all of this, and this is part of the reason why having efficiency, having a big funnel, staying in front of people over an extended duration of time especially for a direct sales team, is so incredibly important. This is part of the reason why there's so much pressure among boards and CFOs and CEOs in a lot of cases to find marketplaces and channel partnerships so appealing, is they are not paying for your base, they're not paying for your tech stack, they're not paying for your benefits, they're not paying for travel, but not paying for any of that until actual close. So when things get squeezed, that's why we see when you're essentially, if you're in the category of selling for this kind of company in a sales role, you inevitably, if you're selling to the smaller part of the market and aren't selling huge deals, you inevitably may get squeezed because there's so much grass is greener mentality with both the indirect playbook and the marketplace playbook, which is why it's so incredibly important for you to figure out a way to connect the dots between your prospects and clients, seeing you as part of their learning and development and professional development and not just another vendor. So that's what I'd be focusing on for your revenue growth goals. If you're reverse engineering into this, you need those 100 new clients. Where are those 100 new clients going to come from? You look at your historical close rate. Let's say you're closing 25%, so you need 400 qualified opportunities. To get 400 qualified opportunities, how many qualified leads do we need? I don't know, maybe it's 5 to 1, maybe it's 10 to 1. Whatever it is, it's a big number. It might be 1,600 leads, 1,800 conference attendees, breakfast seminar attendees, webinar attendees, or something like that. And this starts to give you an appreciation for the kind of volume that you actually need in the top and middle of the parts of your funnel and the early and middle stages of their journey to be able to get to the point that you have 400 sales opportunities to close 100 deals over the next 12 months. So what's it going to take for you to get 1,600, 1,800, 2,000 people to attend your events over the next 12 months? Well, chances are if you have a small classroom or conference room, you're going to be doing a lot of events to be able to fill that up. You're probably going to supplement it with webinars, and almost certainly you're going to need some cold outbound and some ads to be able to supplement that as well, which argues for, if you don't have strong enough unit economics, a lot of this is dead before it actually even starts. So that's the question as well. We're talking about, however, $50,000 clients, which are, it's a considered purchase. It's not a huge like enterprise kind of sale. It's not a 7 or 8 figure kind of sale, but it's significant enough that at a $50K purchase for like a colocation, cloud, and connectivity operator, you can afford to do more than just inside sales, but you're probably not doing extensive travel. But more than likely, you're going to want to come into your facility at some point anyway. So all of this strongly argues for figuring out how to be in the professional development and learning and development business as a core part of your sales strategy, so that multiple stakeholders from these target accounts, from these core accounts, want to spend a lot of time with you and your subject matter expert week after week, month after month in a professional development, learning and development kinds of context. In a lot of ways, it should look a lot like you're in the media and events business, because going forward, that's largely what a lot of the companies you compete against are moving in the direction of. A lot of companies have been doing this for a long time already. A lot of data center operators going back 10 plus years have been investing heavily in webinars and video content and thought leadership and all of that. If it's new to you, don't act as if nobody else is doing this. Again, you're in a very crowded category. Co-location, cloud, and connectivity. You may have hundreds, if not thousands, of potential companies that you're competing against, probably at least dozens, if not hundreds. And in that kind of crowded environment, we need to get really, really specific about how we help throughout the full journey. If you're only focused on that last 17%, expect to be squeezed by marketplaces and channel partners. We need you in early and often, so you have significant surface area and as many of those 25 to 30 touch points as possible. 100% of the buyer's journey coverage, not just phoning it in or being asleep at the wheel for the first 83% of the game. So that's what I would be focusing on for how a co-location, cloud, and connectivity provider can achieve its revenue growth goals. That's the final question that we'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've enjoyed this week's show, be sure to hit the like button on whatever platform that you're watching. And if you're listening and you have the opportunity to rate and review this episode, we would love that as well. If you have an idea for a question or a topic or a challenge that you'd like to see us address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching, and we will add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming episode. If you want to make sure that you get notified and invited to upcoming educational events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes directly to your email inbox on Sundays. You can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. I'm Joshua Feinberg, founder of the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute and host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn and you would like to be, make sure to mention in the note that you send along with the invite that you watch and that you're a fan of Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, and I'd be happy to be connected with you. And speaking of the podcast, if you or someone from your team would make a great guest to interview on a upcoming episode of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast, feel free to message me on LinkedIn as well. That's as great a place as any. We're so glad that you were able to join us for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. We wish you great success in growing your impact, your team's impact, and your company's impact in this tremendous period of growth in all things data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. Look forward to seeing you back again next week. Take care now.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.